Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is chapter 24 of the American Pageant, titled Industry Comes of Age. If you know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad spanning from east to west in the United States, so all the way across the country. It helped unify the country socially, politically, and especially economically because goods could easily be transferred. It also provided a sense of modernization for a nation turning industrialized. So obviously the main effects of any type of railroad transportation, large transportation system, is going to be economic, but in a period of westward expansion, obviously a railroad that can help transfer people as well as goods is going to have some great social effects, and that obviously is going to influence politics because now you have a population that you have to appease out west because of this railroad. Land grants, federal land loaned to railroad companies. It encouraged the construction of railroads, and in combination with federal loans, companies were able to build railroads with more adequate funds and slightly lower risk. So because of federal funding and land funding, basically more railroads, more transportation systems could be constructed, and they were better and more efficient because of that. Cornelius Vanderbilt, steamboat businessman turned to railroad mogul. Obviously, Vanderbilt University. He was the owner of many railroad lines that offered the best transportation services of any of his competitors. He became the most prosperous and most famous of all the railroad investors. Standard time, standardized time zones consisting of 4 regions. So you have, East, West, Pacific, whatever, all the different times that we have today. It helped to organize and therefore make railroad systems safer. It also connected regions in one sense of time, which speaks to the greater sense of national unity that the railroads brought about the U.S. So it's obviously interesting how something like a railroad can unify us in something as broad as time itself. So you can obviously see the profound effect of railroads. Stock watering, railroad stocks being sold for far too high amounts. It was part of the greater sense of corruption that surrounded the big railroad business, where consumers were hurt by the power of the wealthy managers. So things like speculation, people who would game the stock market would take advantage and get a lot of money, and it just fits into the corruption of the time period. Wabash et al. V. Illinois. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it decided that states could not regulate interstate commerce. It meant that the growing power of the railroad monopolies could only be combated by efforts by the federal government. So in the structure of federalism, intrastate commerce, which is commerce occurring in only one state, state governments have regulation over that. And then interstate commerce, which transfers across state lines, the government is the only authority that can rule over that. Interstate Commerce Act regulating the railroad business. It attempted to rid the railroad business of most of its corruption and attacks on consumer interests, but the Interstate Commerce Commission established by it could be easily exploited. So essentially, even though this act created some good guidelines to help keep the interstate commerce through railroads and stuff like that at bay in terms of corruption, it didn't really have a great effect in its actuality. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. His invention helped to connect the world through communication, and it had vast effects on social relations. It also gave new opportunities to women, as many jobs as telephone operators were given to women. So although a telephone doesn't really fit into that transportation type theme that this chapter goes into, it sort of transports verbal ideas, which is just as powerful as physical transportation. And it obviously had some undergrowing social effects on women's rights and equality. Thomas Edison, famous inventor of many things, especially the light bulb. His light bulb was important in changing human habits as they could now see in the night. He made people more productive, as evidenced by the average hours of sleep going down after the light bulb. So of course, the light bulb could now make the night just as productive as the day, and businesses could now work through the night and have those night owls, and that just increases overall economic production. Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, however you want to say it, rich profiteer of steel. Chalk this up with Vanderbilt as your list of business moguls. He developed an innovative business model where one business would employ all stages of production, including transportation, thereby making everything more efficient and higher quality. So he would integrate his control into all stages of production and making goods. And if everything was running through one company, he would have more control, and therefore it'd be a lot easier on him to get goods out at lower prices. J.P. Morgan, a highly successful banker, he took advantage of failing businesses by consolidating them under his own power by placing his own men in their board of directors in exchange for bailing them out. He became a powerful banking imperial. So he would spend money on bailing these businesses out, but he would put himself, basically through his men, in charge of all these companies and businesses, and he basically would control a whole lot of capital and businesses through this method. John D. Rockefeller, owner of Standard Oil Company and the creator of the trust. His formation of the trust business model proved to be an effective way of drowning out competition, which increased the power of his oil company and other large companies in other fields. So through trusts, he would consolidate other companies by basically buying out other companies that were in the same business line as him, his direct competition, and he would control entire markets, which was extremely powerful and impressive. Vertical integration, connecting all phases of manufacturing. This was Carnegie. It helped to make the transportation of supplies more efficient and reliable, which in turn made goods that were of higher quality and lower prices by owning all phases of production and thereby eliminating extra fees and costs. So if you were to say transport through another company or to get your raw goods from another company, you would obviously have to pay them kickbacks and fees. But if you own everything, you don't. So you're able to get things out how you want, more productive, more efficient, and at lower prices. Horizontal integration, forming alliances with other competitors. This was Rockefeller. When competition consolidated together, it formed monopolies in the market and helped make powerful business moguls who took advantage of smaller businesses. So these powerful business moguls would keep consolidating with other companies, gain more and more market share, where eventually they were the majority in whatever good they were producing, and that basically gave them the power to buy out entire markets, and that would be extremely enriching for the company, but would also place a harmful effect on society trying to interact with the market. Trusts, pooling stocks together under one management. It made big companies like Standard Oil more powerful because they manage money in many different businesses, giving moguls more control. So the more businesses they would sort of gain control over through trusts, one business owner, one manager would just get more money, more market share, and that was that. Interlocking directorates, banks controlling failing businesses. This was like J.P. Morgan. It gave powerful bankers more control over businesses because they took advantage of failing ones by bailing them out and controlling them. So if you were a bank and you were basically supporting a business entirely financially, or else they would fail, you obviously have immense control over them just inherently, and that gets you a lot of in and control in the business sphere from a banking perspective. Steel, metal alloy that could be used for things like railroad tracks, a big booming business. The production of steel became an important industry that helped to turn America into an industrial superpower, and it was used to make anything in all aspects of life. So wherever there was a city industrializing transportation in any form, in some, at least a part of it, they were using steel. Social Darwinist idea that people achieve status based on talent. The idea connected to a harsh view of classism in which each class doesn't have a duty to one another, which led to a growth in imperialistic thoughts often connected to racism. So some groups believed that in the social Darwinist system, if you were more rich, you had more talent, and if you were poor and didn't have a talent to do anything, then you didn't have a duty to help them out. They were just not talented, and that's just sort of their fault. And the rich person, as a talented one, could just keep getting things for himself. So obviously not a very societal based way of thinking. Acres of diamonds, religious preaching backing social Darwinism. Lectures like these aided to keep the poorer classes down at the expense of the rich, and such thoughts prevented adequate social reform. So the more preachings like these that basically said that rich people were born to be rich, be successful, and poor people were just born to be unsuccessful, really kept any sort of societal gluing together. Plutocracy, society, or government owned by the wealthy class. Wealthy people and businesses were protected by the Constitution, which upheld plutocracy and limited state government control. So the more, not only were rich people in control of politics, but they are protected by the laws of government, upheld this sort of rich people in control type thing going on. Gospel of wealth, idea that wealthy people had a duty to serve the poor. It was a noble and philanthropic thought popularized by Andrew Carnegie, which gave wealthy moguls a purpose in life beyond their immense wealth and large businesses. So Carnegie is a guy who donated for colleges to schools and helped people with his money, and this was sort of a mode of philanthropy that he started among rich people who didn't want to be just drowning in their own wealth. Sherman Antitrust Act, largely unsuccessful law aiming to limit big trusts. Although it had little effect at preventing large monopolies, it did have a great effect on workers' rights by limiting the formation of labor unions. So part of this Trust Act was not only to stop trusts at the business level, but also at the labor level. So it had basically no effect on businesses because it was pretty easy to get around, but it did have an effect on workers trying to fight for their own rights, which is a whole nother issue in itself. New South, idea of turning the South to industrial production. Back in the day, they were an agricultural, farming-based economy. Many people saw opportunity in industrial ventures in the South because there wasn't much industrial competition down there, but Northern moguls exerted control largely due to their owning of the railroads, which stunted the South's economic growth. So people in the North, rich people who had the transportation and capital controlling down there, they basically wanted to keep the South agricultural because they wanted their control up where it was already in the North. Gibson Girl, magazine depicting independent women. It reflected the growing movement of women into the workforce during the industrial age and the growing popularity of the idea of the independent woman. Lewis Hine, photographer and advocate against child labor. His popular photographs depicted harsh scenes that aroused public contentment towards child labor. His work was also highly influential in the wider world of photography. So as we move into the 20th century, child labor becomes a bigger and bigger issue, especially in the industrial world where the conditions were harsh, and that people like Lewis Hine exposing what was happening to children in these industrial areas with their labor helped to have the child labor laws that we have today. National Labor Union, one of the first large-scale labor unions. It helped to challenge big bosses and the power imbalance between employers and employees. Although it ultimately failed after the Depression in the 1870s, it inspired further movements in uniting laborers. So over the course of the rest of the 19th century into the 20th century, more large-scale labor unions will start to form, all stemming off this National Labor Union. Knights of Labor, here's one of them. Labor Society turned into a union. It was a more inclusive and therefore wider replacement for the National Labor Union, where they were able to make progress in workers' rights, specifically in the 8-hour workday. So the 8-hour workday, 9 to 5, started from labor unions who were advocating to reduce what in some places were 10, 12, 14, 16-hour days. Haymarket Square, labor protests turned deadly. The events at the protest negatively affected public opinion on the Knights of Labor, which spelled the end for their movement. Factions within the Knights went their separate ways. If I remember correctly, bombs went off at this protest and were blamed on the Knights of Labor, which basically ruined any credibility that labor unions had. But it's not to say that the labor movement was stopped completely. American Federation of Labor, collection of numerous labor unions. They had a plan of more moderate and straightforward strategies at creating reform for labor, and this popular but simple boycotts and walkouts threatened business owners. So if you start to sort of consolidate different labor unions in different spheres, different types of work, they become very powerful against these business owners. Closed shop, union-only employees at a business. It unified employees at one business, which balanced the relationship between employers and employees, where the employees were united and could therefore advocate for their rights. So if everyone working at a place was in a union, they could sort of move together against the owners if they were violating their rights, and they would have more control over the business, because if all the workers are in a union, the business cannot survive without the union, so that gave them a lot of power. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.